2 years ago, in an interview with Esquire magazine, former Beatle star Paul McCartney, who was at that time 75 years old, was asked if he felt that he still had something to prove. McCartney responded, "Yeah, all the time. And it's a silly feeling. And I do actually sometimes talk to myself and say, wait a minute, look at this little mountain of achievements. There's an awful lot of them. Isn't that enough? But maybe I could do a bit better. Maybe I could write something that's just more relevant or new. And that always drags you forward. I mean, I never felt like, oh, I did good. Nobody does. Even at the height of the Beatles. I prefer to think there's something I'm not doing quite right. So I'm constantly working on it. I always was. We always were. I mean, look at John Lennon, a mass of paranoia and worries about whether he's doing it right. You only have to listen to his lyrics. I think that's just artists in general. When we look at someone like Paul McCartney or John Lennon, we might think that they have done enough to sit back and rest on their laurels. If you're like me, it shocks us to see that people like them, who have achieved a lot of fame and status, are still driven to gain more. Even at the age of 75, Paul McCartney needed to build on the incredible amount of status that he already has. It is never enough. Can you imagine living the sunset years of your life with a constant craving to be seen by others as better yet? People do not see me the way that I want them to yet. My reputation should be even better. The status that I have does not yet satisfy me. Today, our passage in Genesis presents a very different story of a person who comes to the end of their life. Jacob rejects status in favor of grace-focused living. You know, something dawned on me this week as I studied Genesis chapter 48 that I'd never thought about before. And it's this: a life that is focused on status is the polar opposite of a life that is focused on grace. You cannot be a grace-oriented person while at the same time be concerned about your status. It is one or the other. In our passage today, we will see this contrast. A life that is oriented towards status is far less rewarding. It is fleeting. It does not satisfy. But a life that is grace-oriented is focused on God's will, and in particular, His shepherding us. It is important for us to recognize this, because every one of us needs to perpetually ask ourselves, why am I doing this? You see, there is so much that we may be doing in the church, supposedly for the Lord. But that may, in fact, be more of our pursuing status. I will attend these events, or I will give leadership to that area of ministry because it elevates my sense of value to myself and in the eyes of others. I struggle with this, and I sense many of you may as well. However, 1 Corinthians 3:12 calls every one of those efforts wood, hay, and straw. 1 Corinthians 3 is about our motive, and it says that things done from a motive for our status will be burned up. We won't have any reward from God in eternity with regard to those activities. So the benefit of our passage today, what I'm praying for you and I, is that it will bring us to one of these necessary evaluations about our involvement in God's work and about our life in general. I don't care how old you are. Are you grace-focused? Or are you status concerned? Being grace-focused, trusting God, shepherding our life, is the antidote to being status conscious. As I said earlier, death quickly approached Jacob. And as it did, old Jacob's soul rose above his prosperity and material existence in Egypt to an exercise of faith that was so extraordinary. So much that what is in our passage today gets singled out and cited in the New Testament's Hall of Faith, Hebrews chapter 11. It was selected in this exemplary chapter as the singular event that characterized Jacob as a man of faith. Hebrews 11:21 says this: By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. The extraordinary act of faith here is the subject of our passage today. You might think, what is so extraordinary about a father asking God to bless his favorite son's 2 boys? Wasn't it an even greater act of faith the way he behaved in last week's passage before Pharaoh? Remember how he walked into the court of the world's most powerful man and basically said, "You, Pharaoh, have power over the earth, but the power that I possess is over the heavens." Jacob walked up and blessed Pharaoh. The greater always blesses the lesser. So why is Jacob blessing his 2 grandsons held up as the greatest example of Jacob's strong faith. To be honest, I don't have an answer to show that the events of today's passage are greater than the events of last week's. But I do intend to show you that today's events show an incredible amount of faith. It is a faith that rose out of turning away from status consciousness to a grace-oriented life. Our verses of study concern themselves with Jacob blessing Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. It comes to us in two parts. The first is that Jacob blessed them by formally adopting them as his own. We pick up today in Genesis chapter 48, verses 1 through 7. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, 'Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a company of peoples, and I will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession.' And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem." Joseph came to his dying father with his two half-Egyptian sons. Bringing these two fully cultured Egyptian boys was so that they might personally identify themselves with God's people. Now stop for a moment and think. Such identification with a shepherd clan, and please remember, shepherds were detested by the Egyptians, would ultimately shut them off from Egyptian prominent society. They are at least 17 years old, because Jacob has been in Egypt for 17 years, and they were already born when Jacob arrived. So for the last 17 years, these boys have been raised in the most prestigious Egyptian schools and according to the most privileged Egyptian benefits. Joseph was the number 2 man in all of Egypt, and their mother came from the most respected family heritage of Egypt. No doubt, they have experienced the best that their culture had to offer. They had very high status in the most advantaged culture of the world. Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh entered the bedroom and gazed on the revered old shepherd. Jacob's heart was full. His favorite son and 2 grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were there, dressed, no doubt, like the young Egyptian nobles that they were. Their appearance and mannerisms absolutely would have been more Egyptian than Hebrew. If you or I were Jacob, we might have had our doubts. They're not going to want what I'm about to give them. Look what they already have. What I offer to them is downward mobility. Of course, we don't know what Ephraim and Manasseh were thinking, but we do know that this was not what Jacob thought. Jacob's faith knew different. What the old shepherd had to offer was indeed much better. He had no doubt of that. Read with me, please, again, verses 3 and 4. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. God had appeared to Jacob twice. Once was after his own deception of Isaac, with the wrath of Esau still ringing in his ears. The other time was after the disaster at Shechem, when his sons murdered the men of the entire city. So he had the wrath of all Canaan ringing in his ears that time. Neither of these were proud moments in Jacob's life. They were both very low times. But at both times, God had reconfirmed to Jacob his promises to Abraham and Isaac. This sure is grace, isn't it? You know why I think Ephraim and Manasseh's status did not even cross Jacob's mind? His mind was filled with God's grace. Filling your mind with evidence of God's grace will do that. It will make you unconscious of status. Status and grace are mutually exclusive to each other. You are either living in the atmosphere of one or the other. Jacob knows that what he has is far better than what these two young Egyptian aristocrats have. He wants to adopt his favorite son's boys so he can give to them a double portion of what he is giving to each of his own sons. The Hebrew wording of verse 5 is literally, like Reuben and Simeon, they will be to me. Jacob adopts them not only to stand on equal footing with their uncles, Jacob's own 12 sons, but to become sons 1 and 2, replacing Reuben and Simeon. We have to go to 1 Chronicles 5, verse 1 to see the reason for this. So let's briefly do that. 1 Chronicles 5, verse 1. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the sons of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. We saw at the end of Genesis chapter 35 that Reuben tried to seize his father Jacob's headship of the family. He sent a cultural message to everyone that he was the new head of the family by taking one of Jacob's wives as his own. Now, Simeon led the murderous slaughter of the men of Shechem back in Genesis chapter 34, so he too was replaced. Ephraim and Manasseh displaced Reuben and Simeon as son 1 and son 2. By the time we get to verse 7 here in chapter 48, it would appear that old Jacob begins to digress from what he is doing in adopting these two boys. He suddenly starts talking about his favorite wife, Rachel, and how she died too soon. Look at it again with me, verse 7. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. Some commentaries actually say that Jacob shows an aged mind that has trouble staying on the subject at hand. But this is not the case. Jacob was saying that if it were up to him, his choice would have been to give his great inheritance to more children that came from these boys' grandmother, Rachel. And now he has discovered a way that he can do that. Jacob legitimizes the adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh on the basis of the premature demise of Rachel. Rachel had not borne enough sons before her premature death. Jacob's mind is focused on grace. Indeed, it brought him so much grief when Rachel died. But even so, God has provided a yearning that Jacob had concerning his beloved. These boys are Rachel's descendants and will have a lot of the great inheritance. When our life is grace-focused, we can see God's hand of blessing. But when we are status conscious, all we can see is how we have been slighted. I surely deserve better. People just do not esteem me high enough. I don't get any respect. But Jacob was seeing God's blessing. And now that Jacob has expressed his reasons for adopting these boys as his and Rachel's sons, our text takes us right into the formal procedure of him doing just that. Genesis 48, verses 8 and 9. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Once again, I believe that many of the commentaries miss it here. They say that Jacob did not recognize who Joseph's sons were because he had poor eyesight. I guess what they want us to think is that they had been standing in Jacob's presence next to their father as young Egyptian nobles while Jacob talks about them. And then the wandering old mind of aged Jacob suddenly becomes lucid and notices them. But he cannot figure out who these young Egyptian nobles with Joseph are. I don't think that is the case. More than one historical resource that I read points to a cultural factor. Who are these is not an indication of Jacob's blindness, but the initiation of the adoption ceremony. Just as in modern day weddings, when near the beginning the minister may ask, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" The ceremonial response, "Her mother and I do," is also paralleled in Joseph's ceremonial response in verse 9. The sons were given by God, and they are the very ones born in Egypt. And so the formal adoption ceremony began as they came close to Jacob. Verse 12 continues the ceremony, but first, two things needed to be addressed. Verses 10 and 11. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Instead of blind old Jacob approaching the boys, which I guess was the normal custom, Joseph had to bring his sons near to Jacob. And then Jacob broke down before he can continue with the ritual. When Joseph became a slave, Jacob thought Joseph was dead, and he wept in despair. Genesis 37, verse 34. But eventually, God's plan allowed Jacob to regain not only his son, but his grandchildren as well. Listen. A focus on God's grace reminds us that circumstances are never so bad that they are ever beyond God's help. When we belong to a loving God, we simply don't know yet what good he may bring out of a seemingly hopeless situation. Verse 12. Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. In willfully giving his sons to his father to be adopted, Joseph shows his own faith in the promised inheritance to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is far better than all the Egyptian privilege and status that they currently had. And now that the formality of adoption has been completed, there was the other formality to accomplish: the official blessing and bestowing of their great inheritance upon them. Verses 13 and 14. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands. For Manasseh was the firstborn. Here, the drama intensifies as we follow every movement. Joseph's positioning of his sons made it convenient for his nearly blind father to place his right hand, the hand of symbolic action and power, on the head of the firstborn, Manasseh, and his left hand on Ephraim's head. The immense importance that this had for Joseph is seen in the precision of the language, with the repeated use of right and left 7 times in verses 13 and 14. The placement of the sons fits the cultural expectation of the prominence of the firstborn son. However, Jacob, we are about to see, purposefully avoids Joseph's action, and he crosses his hands, placing his right hand on the younger son, Ephraim, and his left hand on the older son, Manasseh. And then Jacob continued. Verses 15 and 16. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Jacob spoke of God as his shepherd throughout his life. God had not failed to care for Jacob. Jacob had indeed failed God, but God is faithful and did not ever fail Jacob. Grace. When you and I see God as our great shepherd who has never failed us in his leading, whatever status we have brings contentment. To be grace-oriented means that we see God as the good shepherd that he is, and to trust in his provision and care. A mind that is filled with thoughts of God's grace and a mind that yearns for greater status are polar opposites. Grace is the antidote to status consciousness. Jacob is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh by putting them under the care of God, who shepherds us, and under his angel, who delivers us from evil by crippling us whenever he needs to, in order to make us depend on God and not our own strength. That is exactly what the angel of the Lord did to Jacob. He crippled Jacob just before he met Esau to make Jacob see his need to depend on God. Depending on God and not himself is what redeemed Jacob spiritually. It is what redeems us as well. But all of a sudden, Joseph interrupts his father, and a dispute occurred about the proper social expectation. Verses 17 through 20. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Joseph was appalled. His father had transgressed every tradition from the Nile to the Euphrates. All Manasseh's years had been lived with the privilege and expectation of being the firstborn son. Joseph had worked to instill firstborn character and the necessary sense of responsibility in Manasseh. This humiliation would be an undeserved wound to him. Why had the old man crossed his hands? So a dispute occurred between Joseph and Jacob, but the dispute did not last long because Joseph quickly and wisely complied. Joseph realized that Jacob was blessing by divine inspiration. We see here a good illustration of yielding to the will of God. Though you had years and years of different expectation. Joseph, being understandably agitated by his father's action, cried, "Not so! Not so, my father! For this is the firstborn. Put your right hand upon this boy's head." He thought Jacob's short-sightedness accounted for this action. However, Jacob knew what he was doing. "I know it, my son. I know it," he said. So Jacob's faith overcame the will of man, which was based on cultural norms and years of normal expectation. Jacob blessed them, saying, "Both will be great, but the younger will be greater than the older son." That was not just the stubbornness of an old man used to having his own way. It was not a personal preference, but a prophetic announcement. In the future, whenever one Jew wanted to bless another Jew, a common phrase was, "May God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh." They were Israel's two largest tribes. They were given the two largest territories of the promised land. Jacob was a true prophet. Accordingly, Ephraim certainly became the greater of the two tribes. Ephraim became so dominant that after the 10 tribes broke away to set up its rival kingdom, it was Jeroboam, an Ephraimite, who led the rebellion, 1 Kings 11:26. As time wore on, all 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were simply known as Ephraim. It had taken Jacob a lifetime of divine discipline to learn that he must only speak and do the will of God. Now he dared to trust God and believe God's plans were best, even if they go against the tide of social norms. Grace orientation is consumed with being obedient to God's revealed will. Status consciousness is imprisoned by social norms. It cannot recognize God's will if it goes against social expectations. Now, Jacob loved his son Joseph, but he even went against his beloved son's wishes to do God's will. Fortunately, Joseph, knowing a lot about God's grace, quickly submitted to it as well. I can see why Hebrews 11 holds this act up so high as an act of faith. How willing are you to break social expectations and the expectations of a loved one to follow God's will? Your relationships may suffer, and people will think that you are nuts. There are so many lessons for us here about grace. Grace is totally at God's discretion. We love grace when it's applied to us in forgiveness, but our dirty little secret is that we don't like it when we see it applied to someone else who appears favored over us. Why didn't I get that measure of your grace, Lord? Yet the only way for us to have the benefits of grace and forgiveness is to have grace manifested toward us as totally at God's own discretion. The crossed hands of blessing tell us that grace typically surprises. 1 Corinthians 1, verses 27 through 29 says this. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. This is what makes the gospel so wild and wonderful, because no one is beyond God's grace. The proudest, most vicious, meanest man in town can, and often does, find grace. There is a wildness to God's mercy. And when it comes to living a life of faith, the crossed hands of blessing need to provide you and I with some essential wisdom. Wouldn't you agree that there have been many times over the years that we have put forward some cherished desire to God's right hand and are displeased, like Joseph, that he crosses his hands and we end up with something else? Has that ever happened to you? In times like that, we may think, perhaps God does not know the severity of this situation. But he answers, I know it, my son. I know it. It is not because he does not understand or regard our need. He sometimes refuses to gratify our whole desire, or he pours upon us blessings that are different than our most earnest longings. But with the grace that he does give us, we must see him as our loving shepherd who knows what is best for us. Jacob knew that Joseph shared his strong faith, He knew that Joseph would not be clinging to his Egyptian status. So Jacob gifts Joseph with a parcel in the promised land. Verses 21 and 22. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you, and will bring you again into the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow." Genesis 48 gives a remarkable portrait of an old man who took full charge of his own death. His faith on his deathbed was the singular triumph of his life. He got his way by being grace-focused. How about you? Do you purposefully have your mind sweep through the years and, like a magnet that attracts iron particles when it is swept through sand, find evidence of God's grace? Being grace-oriented is the antidote for being status-conscious. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 12 through 14.